He was a man of God, a beloved preacher, a husband, and a father. His sermons inspired, his words commanded respect, and his presence in the community was revered. But behind closed doors, his perfect world was built on a lie. And when that lie was exposed, it shattered everything, unleashing a darkness no one could have imagined. One secret turned him from a devout leader into a monster, a man who would commit the ultimate sin, murdering his entire family in cold blood. What drives a man who preaches love and salvation to become a cold-blooded killer? How does blind rage consume a person to the point of no return? Was this about morality, betrayal, or something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface? This case is one of faith, deception, and unimaginable horror. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more disturbing tales of betrayal, murder, and the darkest corners of the human soul. Kendrick Caldwell was a man of conviction. At 43 years old, he stood tall at the pulpit of Holy Covenant Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi, his voice thundering through the sanctuary as he delivered yet another sermon on morality. Sin, chastity, obedience, these were the pillars of his teachings, and he preached them with an authority that left no room for doubt. To his congregation, he was a man chosen by God, a shepherd leading his flock away from temptation and toward righteousness. His church wasn't just a place of worship, it was an empire, built on his reputation as a fire and brimstone preacher who did not bend, did not waver, and did not tolerate corruption within his house. And standing beside him, the epitome of grace and godly womanhood, was his wife, Samaria Caldwell. She was stunning, elegant yet modest, a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity. To the women of the church, she was a role model. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the kind of woman who knew her place as a dutiful helpmate to a man of God. To the men, she was untouchable, an example of purity in a world drowning in sin. Samaria met Kendrick when she was just a young woman, drawn to his passion and his unwavering devotion to the Lord. He pursued her with the kind of intensity that made her feel chosen, special, as though their union was part of God's divine plan. When they married, she stepped effortlessly into the role of a preacher's wife, tending to the church, their home, and eventually, their 3 beautiful children. Zariah, their eldest, was 12, sharp, observant, and already growing into a young woman. Karen, 8 years old, idolized his father, following him around the church, hanging on to his every word. And little Melanie, just 4, was still wrapped in the innocence of childhood, unaware of the weight her family carried. The Caldwells were admired by everyone who knew them. They were the embodiment of faith, discipline, and family values, a shining example of what it meant to live a life devoted to God. Kendrick and Samaria were more than just a couple, they were a brand, an image of righteousness in a world that Kendrick often condemned as lost. But images are only that, images. Carefully curated, meticulously maintained. And beneath the surface of their perfect life, behind the polished sermons and the loving smiles, there was a secret. A secret Samaria had been hiding for over a decade. A secret that, once exposed, would destroy them all. Kendrick Caldwell preached about purity. About discipline. About the sacred role of a wife in a God-fearing household. Every Sunday, he stood before his congregation at Holy Covenant Baptist Church, his voice booming as he condemned temptation and sin, reminding the women of their duty, to be virtuous, to be submissive, to be modest in both body and spirit. And every Sunday, his wife, Samaria, sat in the front pew, nodding along, hands folded neatly in her lap. The perfect preacher's wife. The devoted mother. The very embodiment of everything Kendrick demanded from a woman. But Samaria Caldwell had a secret. A secret that had been hidden for over a decade. Long before she met Kendrick, before she ever stepped into the role of a pastor's wife, Samaria had lived another life, one far removed from church pews and Sunday service. Under the alias, Naya Divine, she had been an anonymous online seductress, running a lucrative OnlyFans account that catered to thousands of paying subscribers. And even after she married Kendrick, even after she vowed before God and man to be the obedient wife of a preacher, she never stopped. By day, she was Samaria Caldwell, the stunning, soft-spoken matriarch of the church, a woman praised for her grace and humility. But by night, when Kendrick was asleep, she became Nia Divine, broadcasting to a world that had no idea who she really was. It started as a temptation she couldn't quite shake, but soon, it became something more, a business, a source of power, an escape. She told herself it wasn't truly wrong. After all, she wasn't physically cheating. No one was touching her. No one knew. And the money? The money was undeniable. Thousands of dollars flowed into her secret bank account every month. It gave her security. Independence. A private world beyond Kendrick's rules, beyond his sermons, beyond the expectations of the church. For years, she perfected the art of deception, learning exactly when and where to hide her second life. She kept a burner phone locked away, wiped every trace of evidence, and always made sure Kendrick was none the wiser. Despite his extreme views on women's purity, he remained blissfully unaware. Until the night everything fell apart. Samaria had been careful. Meticulous. But she wasn't the only one watching. Someone in the congregation had been paying attention. Someone had stumbled upon Nia Divine's account. And unlike her thousands of anonymous subscribers, this person didn't just watch. They plotted. A message arrived on Kendrick's phone late one night. No name. No number. Just a single link. At first, he ignored it. A mistake, he assumed. Spam. Kendrick's phone buzzed again. It was a text message, and though the number was unfamiliar, he couldn't help but open it. And when the screen loaded, when he saw what was in front of him, his world, his marriage, his very identity, began to shatter. The message itself was simple, but it held the weight of the world. Pastor, your wife is an abomination. See for yourself. Attached was a video, Samaria, dressed in lingerie, leaning toward the camera, whispering in a voice so seductive it made Kendrick's stomach churn. His heart raced as he watched her in ways he had never imagined, but worse was the knowledge that thousands of men were watching her in the same way, lusting after his wife in the shadows. Each click on his phone brought him deeper into the nightmare. There were comments, profiles, subscriptions, the truth of Samaria's betrayal laid bare. The floor beneath him seemed to disappear as he scrolled through the countless images of his wife that were never meant for his eyes. Every sermon, every prayer, every word he'd preached about purity, righteousness, and the sanctity of marriage, it was all a lie. His wife, the woman who stood beside him in front of his congregation, had been hiding a dark, sinful existence. And all the while, he had believed in the very moral foundation that was now crumbling beneath him. Kendrick stood frozen, his phone in his trembling hands, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. He had built a life, a ministry, a reputation on the very thing Samaria had defiled. The image of their perfect family, their perfect life, it was shattered in an instant. Without thinking, he stormed out of his office and into his car. His mind was a blur, thoughts racing at a speed he could barely comprehend. How long, he thought. How long has she been doing this? How could she hide this from me? Each thought only deepened his rage. She's a harlot. A liar. A disgrace. A sinner. She's ruined everything. She's ruined me. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The drive home was a blur, a twisting road of thoughts and fury. His pulse hammered in his ears. He barely noticed the time ticking away as he sped through the streets, heading straight toward the woman who had been the cornerstone of his life, and had now become the source of his deepest humiliation. Kendrick slammed the door open as he entered their home. His phone, still clutched in his hand, slid across the kitchen counter, the screen facing Samaria. She had already seen it, and the look in her eyes made her go pale. The silence was thick, suffocating. Kendrick's voice boomed through the house. "What the hell is this? How long?" His veins bulged from his forehead, his fists clenched at his sides. The righteous anger he had so often preached about now consumed him, and there was no room for compassion. No room for understanding. No room for anything but rage. Samaria stood there, wide-eyed and trembling. She knew the moment was coming, the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. She didn't try to defend herself right away. She didn't argue. Instead, she did the only thing she could, she confessed. Her voice trembled as she admitted the truth, telling Kendrick that she had been living this double life for over 11 years, even before they were married. The weight of the words hit Kendrick like a ton of bricks, each sentence unraveling the foundation of his beliefs. But it wasn't the words that ignited the fire inside him. It was the realization, the deep, visceral truth that the woman he had loved and trusted had deceived him for more than a decade. She had been lying to him. His mind couldn't process it. It was too much. 11 years. 11 years of betrayal. 11 years of lies. His entire world felt like it was spinning out of control. Samaria, desperate to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, saw the fire in Kendrick's eyes. She pleaded, tried to say the words that might bring him back to her, but it was too late. The rage had consumed him. It drowned out every word she spoke. And in that moment, as the weight of the betrayal set in, Kendrick snapped. Kendrick's mind was no longer his own. Rage clouded his vision as he looked at the woman who had betrayed him, who had defiled the sacred vows they had taken together. Without thinking, he swung a fist toward her, the force of it knocking Samaria sideways. She crashed into the kitchen counter, the sound of her body hitting the hard surface barely registering to Kendrick as the anger surged through him. He was no longer a man of God. He was a beast, consumed by fury, and there was no stopping what was coming next. Without warning, he grabbed her by the hair, jerking her upright. The sound of her muffled cries only fueled the fire within him. He slammed her head against the refrigerator, the sickening thud reverberating through the room. Samaria's knees buckled beneath her, but Kendrick wasn't done. He was too far gone to care about the tears streaming down her face, the pleas for mercy that fell from her lips. He had lost all sense of reason. With a violent roar, Kendrick wrapped his hands around Samaria's throat. His fingers dug into her skin, squeezing harder with each passing second as she struggled beneath him. Her hands clawed at his arms, her body writhing in panic, but it was no use. Kendrick watched as her movements slowed, her eyes filled with terror, her breath becoming shallower. The realization of what was happening seemed to break through to her, and she gasped for air, her last words barely audible. "Kendrick, please, I'm sorry, but it was too late." With one final squeeze, her body went limp in his hands, and Kendrick dropped her to the floor like a ragdoll, his chest heaving with exertion. He stared down at her lifeless form, unable to comprehend what he had just done. She was gone. His wife, his partner, the mother of his children, she was gone. But the worst was yet to come. The screams had echoed through the house, high-pitched and filled with terror, waking their children from their slumber. Zariah, the oldest at 12, rushed out of her bedroom, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Mom? Daddy, what's going on?" she cried, but Kendrick didn't even look at her. He was too consumed by the rage that still burned in his veins. Zariah tried to run, to escape the nightmare unfolding in their home, but Kendrick was faster. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back toward him with terrifying strength. The look in his eyes was not the look of a father, but of something else, something cold and murderous. In one swift motion, he snapped her neck, the sickening crack echoing through the house as her body went limp in his arms. Karen, his 8-year-old son, stumbled into the kitchen next, crying out in fear, "Daddy, no. Please, I'm sorry, please. He fell to his knees, begging Kendrick for his life. But Kendrick didn't care. The rage had consumed him entirely. Without a second thought, he grabbed a knife from the counter and plunged it deep into Karen's chest. The boy's body jerked as the blade cut through him, but Kendrick didn't stop. He watched as his son bled out, his sobs turning into gurgled gasps for air. Finally, there was Melanie, the youngest, only 4 years old. She was too young to understand what had just happened, too innocent to grasp the horror that had unfolded. She looked up at her father with sleepy eyes, smiling as she rubbed the sleep from her face. But Kendrick's eyes were void of any warmth. He saw nothing but the reflection of his own rage, his own broken world in her innocent gaze. Melanie didn't stand a chance. With a cold, almost mechanical motion, Kendrick grabbed a pillow from the couch and smothered her, pressing it tightly against her face. The child struggled for a few moments, her tiny hands pushing against the pillow, but it wasn't enough. Kendrick held the pillow in place until her body went still, her little chest no longer rising and falling. The house was silent now. The screams had stopped. The horror had unfolded. Kendrick stood there in the center of the chaos, his breath heavy and ragged as he looked down at the carnage he had created. What was once a home filled with love and laughter was now a scene of unimaginable horror, a testament to the destruction that blind rage could cause. But for Kendrick, it wasn't over yet. The blood on his hands was just the beginning. The next morning, Kendrick walked into Holy Covenant Baptist Church. The sun had barely risen, casting an eerie glow over the stained glass windows. His clothes were soaked in blood, his hands trembling, but his face was eerily calm. He stepped up to the pulpit, adjusting the microphone as if preparing for another sermon, yet this time, the words that left his lips were far from the gospel. I have rid my home of sin. I have done God's will, Kendrick declared, his voice cold and resolute. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, their impact reverberating throughout the sanctuary. The congregation, still trickling in for morning prayer, froze in disbelief. Their pastor, this man of faith, this man they had revered, had just confessed to something unspeakable. The room erupted in chaos. Screams filled the space as people scrambled to comprehend what they had just heard. Whispers of, "What is he talking about? What did he do?" echoed through the pews. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others rushed toward the doors in a frantic attempt to escape. Kendrick stood at the pulpit, unblinking, as if waiting for their shock to subside. The horror in the room only seemed to fuel his conviction. A woman, her face pale with fear, ran to the back of the church and dialed 911. "He's confessing. There's blood on him. He's done something terrible, please, send help." The call was enough. Within minutes, sirens blared in the distance, drawing closer with each passing second. The doors of Holy Covenant Baptist Church flew open, and officers flooded in, weapons drawn, but Kendrick didn't flinch. He didn't move. His arms raised in mock reverence, as though he were still the preacher in front of his flock, ready to deliver the most sacred of messages. The officers didn't waste any time. They knew who he was, the pastor of Holy Covenant, a man who had built an empire on faith, morality, and God's word. They had no idea what he had become. Kendrick's arrest was swift. He didn't resist as the officers handcuffed him, their hands firm around his wrists. He didn't speak again as they led him out of the church, his bloodied figure a stark contrast to the quiet reverence of the space he had once called home. His face, though, showed no emotion, only the same calm that had overtaken him during his confession. The scene at the Caldwell home was even more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Officers arrived at the house shortly after Kendrick's arrest, only to find the gruesome aftermath of the night's slaughter. The bodies of Samaria, Zariah, Karen, and Melanie were scattered throughout the home, their blood staining the carpets, the walls, and the furniture. The once loving home had turned into a house of horrors, a grotesque monument to Kendrick's rage. Forensic teams moved quickly, documenting the scene, while detectives pieced together what had happened. It was clear that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime. The brutality, the precision with which each life had been taken, spoke to a mind consumed by anger and betrayal. The fact that Kendrick had walked into the church the next morning, drenched in blood and unrepentant, left little doubt about his guilt. Kendrick Caldwell was arrested without resistance, his fate sealed in that moment of confession. He was led away, his steps heavy but unhurried, as the weight of his actions finally began to settle in. He had done what he believed was God's will, but in the eyes of the law, it was murder. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the trial of Kendrick Caldwell reached its climactic moments. The prosecution made its case with chilling precision, painting Kendrick not as a misguided man who had momentarily lost his way, but as a cold, calculating individual who had systematically taken the lives of his wife and children. The evidence was damning, his confession at the church, the blood-stained clothes, the testimonies from those who knew him. His own words, spoken in the sanctity of the pulpit, only sealed his fate. To the jury, there was no ambiguity. Kendrick Caldwell, the man who had once stood as a beacon of righteousness, was now the embodiment of hypocrisy and depravity. The defense, scrambling for any thread of hope, attempted to push for an insanity plea. They argued that Kendrick's actions were a result of some mental breakdown, a loss of control after the supposed betrayal of his wife. But the jury saw through the facade. They didn't buy the story of a man pushed to the brink. They saw a man who, despite his professed faith, had chosen violence over resolution, death over forgiveness. The defense's plea fell flat, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning their verdict, guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. When the foreperson read the verdict aloud, a wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. The family and friends of Samaria, Zariah, Karen, and Milani felt a fleeting sense of justice, but it was tempered by the unspeakable horror of what had been lost. The tears of those who mourned could never bring back the lives Kendrick had stolen. The sentencing phase was almost anticlimactic after the verdict. Kendrick stood before the judge, his face impassive, showing no emotion, as if this was merely another sermon, another audience. The judge, looking over the details of the case, didn't mince words in delivering the sentence. "You are not a man of God. You are a murderer," the judge declared, his voice unwavering. "You have taken the lives of the very people you swore to protect, and for that, you will pay the ultimate price." Kendrick's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that would strip him of everything he had built, a life of faith, a life of power, a life of perceived righteousness. The man who had preached so fiercely about sin and repentance would now face the consequences of his own actions. As Kendrick was led out of the courtroom, his expression remained unreadable, but his lips parted for one final statement. "The wages of sin is death," he muttered, as if speaking to an invisible audience. It was a chilling reminder of the twisted logic that had justified his actions, a stark echo of the self-righteousness that had ultimately destroyed his family. The courtroom doors closed behind him, and Kendrick Caldwell's life, once filled with fame, power, and religious influence, was reduced to a death sentence, the final chapter in a story of blind rage, betrayal, and a tragic fall from grace. This case serves as a chilling reminder that those who scream the loudest about morality often harbor the darkest secrets. Kendrick Caldwell built his life on a foundation of righteousness, using his position as a preacher to dictate the lives of others, all while hiding the very sins he condemned. His image as a devoted man of God, a father, and a husband, was shattered in an instant, revealing the true monster lurking beneath. Kendrick Caldwell's horrific actions weren't a result of a momentary lapse in judgment, they were the culmination of years of suppressed anger, self-righteousness, and ego. Was this tragedy truly about morality, or was it about Kendrick's fragile sense of control being obliterated by the betrayal of a woman he had sworn to protect? Was he a man whose ego was shattered, or was he always a monster, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed? The answers lie in the twisted mind of a man who believed he was above reproach, until his own sins were revealed in the most unimaginable way. If this story shocked you, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more disturbing cases of love, lies, and murder.